Now that you know how to write conditional statements in if-then form with the hypothesis and the conclusion, we're going to talk about today writing related conditionals. So sentences that are related to the first one, but where we reorder your hypothesis and conclusion. So if we look at the original conditional, the hypothesis follows if. So we'll highlight the hypothesis here. If two angles have the same measure, and the conclusion follows then, so we know they are congruent. So that's our original P and Q. So hypothesis and conclusion. If we want to write the converse, that's kind of like if you think of vice versa. So we switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So now instead of the pink coming first, it'll be orange. So the conclusion will become like our new hypothesis, and then we'll follow it up. So we're switching. So now this would read, if two angles are congruent, then they have the same measure. The reason that we said instead of if they are congruent, we like to, in a sentence, grammatically, you want to start out with what you're talking about. So if you say they, people don't know what you're talking about. So we just kind of left the two angles part there. So if two angles are congruent, then they have the same measure, which is true. The inverse is we leave the same order and we do what's called negate. So negate means do the opposite. So we use a symbol like a little squiggly line. That means not P, then not Q. And when you negate something, you can use words like won't, don't, can't, isn't, not, etc. It depends on what makes sense grammatically. So we are going to go up to our original hypothesis. Instead of saying if two angles have the same measure, we will say if two angles don't have the same measure, then they are not congruent. So we kept the same order, but we added in a word that would negate. So we use the word don't, and they are not congruent. So to negate they are congruent, we use the word not. So if two angles don't have the same measure, then they are not congruent. So we'll make that a little bit bigger, easier to see. Okay, so that's called the inverse. We negate, but we keep the same order. The last is contrapositive. So we take the converse, so where it's switched, and we negate hypothesis and conclusion. So we switch and negate. So if two angles are not congruent, then they do not have the same measure. So again, we put in words that will negate. So if two angles are not congruent, then they do not have the same measure. So just to review, the conditional is your original statement. Hypothesis, conclusion. If two angles have the same measure, then they are congruent. The converse, we want to switch. So if two angles are congruent, then they have the same measure. So here, if you were to highlight, this was our original Q, and this was our original P. So we switched them. Inverse, keep the same order, but put a negating word, so like don't or not, whatever makes sense as you write it. And then the contrapositive, we switch it and negate it. So this was our original Q. Again, we put in a negating word. And this was our original P. And again, we negated it by saying do not. So those are called related conditionals because the three new statements all relate to the first one.